Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. Today we're diving deep, really deep, into a date that, well, it lives in infamy. December 7th, 1941, we're going beyond the headlines, beyond the simple facts, to really unravel the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Think of it less like a history lesson and more like uncovering a complex, high-stakes narrative. We'll look at why it happened, how it unfolded, and the human stories tangled up in it all. And we've got a particularly fascinating, maybe a lesser-known angle to explore too, involving Japanese midget submarines and the very first Japanese prisoner of war captured by the U.S.
It's essential to set the stage. This didn't happen in a vacuum. For years leading up to 41, tensions between Japan and the U.S. were just ratcheting up. Japan was expanding aggressively in Asia, Manchuria, then China, and the U.S. response, it was pushing back, mostly economically. Sanctions, trade restrictions.
Right, trying to apply pressure without direct conflict, initially anyway?
Exactly. But the big one, the real turning point, was the U.S. oil embargo in the summer of 1941. Japan was incredibly dependent on imported oil. Something like 80% of its supply came from the U.S. at that point. Suddenly, that lifeline was cut.
Wow, 80%. So that forces their hand, doesn't it? They need resources, especially fuel, to keep their military and empire going.
Precisely. Southeast Asia, the Dutch, East Indies, Malaya suddenly looked like the only answer. Rich in oil, rubber, tin, everything Japan needed. But standing in the way, potentially, was the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which President Roosevelt had moved to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, back in 1940.
A strategic move meant as a deterrent, perhaps.
Yeah, it was the idea, yes. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, saw it differently. He saw it as a threat that needed to be neutralized. He started planning this audacious, preemptive strike. The goal was to cripple the fleet, knock the U.S. out of the picture, at least temporarily.
Giving Japan breathing room to make its move in Southeast Asia.
Exactly. He even studied other naval air attacks, like the British strike on the Italian fleet at Taranto. He was looking for methods, for proof of concept.
It's such a massive gamble, though, attacking the U.S. directly.
A huge gamble. Yamamoto himself apparently had doubts about a long war with the U.S., but he believed this sharp, stunning blow might break American will, lead to a negotiated peace favorable to Japan. And, diplomacy had basically failed by late 1941. The U.S. issued the Hull Note, demanding Japan withdraw from China, something Japan was just unwilling to do.
So the military options seemed like the only path forward from their perspective.
It seemed that way to the military leadership. Emperor Hirohito himself reportedly hesitated, understanding the immense risks, but eventually gave his authorization for the attack.
What about the American side? Was there any expectation of an attack?
Well, yes and no. War with Japan was definitely seen as a possibility, even a likelihood, by late 1941. But the consensus, the dominant belief within the U.S. military and government, was that if Japan struck, the Philippines would be the target. It was closer, strategically vital.
And maybe Pearl Harbor seemed too difficult a target to reach undetected.
That was part of it. There was a definite underestimation of Japan's naval aviation capabilities and their sheer boldness, their ability to project power across the Pacific and coordinate multiple major operations simultaneously.
So the objectives were clear. Take out the battleships, the core of the U.S. fleet, buy time, and shock the Americans into submission.
Yes, essentially. Cripple the fleet to prevent interference in the South, gain maybe 6 months to consolidate their gains, and hopefully break American morale. But there were some, let's say, built-in flaws in the plan, looking back.
Like what?
Well, targeting battleships was key, but attacking them in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor meant many could potentially be salvaged, which, of course, they were.
Ah, right. Sinking them in deep ocean is one thing, but in a harbor.
Exactly. And then there was the huge stroke of luck for the Americans. The aircraft carriers weren't there. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all out at sea on other missions.
Which turned out to be absolutely critical later in the war.
Immensely critical. Carriers became the dominant naval weapon. Losing battleships was bad, but losing carriers would have been catastrophic. And another Japanese oversight, driven by their belief in a short war, was ignoring the shore infrastructure.
You mean like the repair yards and fuel depots?
Yes, the Navy Yard's repair facilities, the massive oil storage tanks, the submarine base, these were all left untouched. Hitting those could have severely hampered the U.S. ability to operate out of Pearl Harbor for a long, long time. But the focus was entirely on the ships and planes.
Okay, so let's talk about the attack itself, the Japanese fleet. How did they approach?
A powerful task force, the Kido Butai, centered around 6 aircraft carriers, sailed from northern Japan in late November. Absolute radio silence, treacherous northern route to avoid detection. They launched their planes in 2 waves on the morning of December 7th.
What kind of planes were involved?
A mix. You had fighters, the famous Zeros, to gain air superiority in strafe airfields. Then level bombers and dive bombers targeting ships and airfields. And crucially, torpedo bombers. These carried specially modified torpedoes.
The ones you mentioned for shallow water.
That's right. They had wooden fins attached so they wouldn't plunge too deep into the mud when dropped. An ingenious adaptation. They also launched reconnaissance float planes earlier from cruisers to get a final check on the ships in the harbor.
And this is where those midget submarines come in, right?
Yes. 5 two-man midget submarines were launched from larger mother submarines just outside the harbor entrance. Their mission was to sneak inside and attack the battleships with their torpedoes.
Okay, and you mentioned one had a particularly rough time.
Yes, the Hay 19. It's quite the story. Its gyro compass failed, it ran aground on a reef, got free, then ran aground again near Bellows Field on the east side of Oahu. The pilot, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, tried to scuttle the sub, failed, swam ashore, passed out, and was captured the next day by a U.S. Army sergeant.
Just like that. He becomes the first Japanese POW of the war.
The very first. It's a bizarre footnote to the massive destruction happening just miles away. One other midget sub was sunk by the destroyer USS Ward even before the air attack began, arguably the first shots fired by the U.S. in the conflict. The other 3 were also lost, likely sunk within the harbor. There's still some debate if one managed to fire torpedoes that hit a battleship.
Okay, before we go further into the attack's impact, let's pause for a moment. If you're finding this deep dive into the intricacies of Pearl Harbor as compelling as we do, make sure you hit that subscribe button on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast.
We unravel complex historical events like this regularly, and you won't want to miss what's next.
So, back to that morning. Despite the secrecy, there was a warning sign, wasn't there? The radar.
Yes, a huge one. An Army radar station at Opana Point on Oahu's north shore detected a large flight of aircraft approaching, well over 100 miles out. This was the first wave. They reported it, but the lieutenant on duty tragically dismissed it. He assumed it was a scheduled flight of American B-17 bombers coming in from California.
A fatal misinterpretation. Absolutely devastating. So the first wave arrived largely unopposed initially. Around 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the attacks began. First hitting airfields like Wheeler and Hickam to destroy planes on the ground.
Taking out the threat of counterattack from the air.
Exactly. Then the main event. The assault on Battleship Row and other ships in the harbor. The message flashed out, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill."
Chilling words. What was the state of readiness on the American side when the bombs started falling?
Generally, quite low for a Sunday morning. Many sailors were ashore or just waking up. Ammunition lockers were often locked. Anti-aircraft guns weren't fully manned. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, making them easy targets for strafing.
But there were instances of resistance.
Oh, definitely. Amidst the chaos, you had incredible bravery. Sailors rushing to battle stations, sometimes under heavy fire, trying to get machine guns firing, attempting to get ships underway.
Some pilots managed to scramble into the air, didn't they?
A few, yes. Pilots like Kenneth Taylor and George Welch managed to get their P-40s airborne from a smaller field and actually shot down several Japanese planes. Incredible heroism against overwhelming odds.
Then the second wave came in, around an hour after the first, about 170 aircraft. Their targets were similar: finish off damaged ships, hit more airfields, reinforce the destruction.
The cumulative effect was just staggering, the casualties.
Terrible. 2,403 Americans were killed. That includes sailors, soldiers, Marines, and nearly 70 civilians. Another 11,178 were wounded.
And the USS Arizona. That name is synonymous with the attack.
It is. A bomb, likely a converted armor-piercing shell, penetrated its forward magazine. The resulting explosion was immense, catastrophic. It sank the ship in minutes, killing 11,177 men aboard, nearly half the total deaths that day. It remains a memorial where it sank.
You also hear about the civilian firefighters caught in the attack.
Yes, at Hickam Field. Honolulu Fire Department engines responded to the fires caused by the bombing. Tragically, 3 firefighters were killed and 6 wounded when Japanese planes strafed them. They were later awarded Purple Hearts, the only civilian firefighters, I believe, to receive that decoration for actions during an enemy attack on U.S. soil.
What about the physical damage to the fleet and aircraft?
It was extensive. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Besides Arizona, the Oklahoma capsized entirely after multiple torpedo hits. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada all sank upright or settled in the mud. Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland suffered varying degrees of damage. The old target ship Utah also capsized. 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and several other vessels were damaged or sunk. And over 300 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged.
A devastating blow. What were the Japanese losses in comparison?
Relatively very light. They lost 29 aircraft in total over both waves. All 5 midget submarines were lost. And in terms of personnel, about 130 Japanese airmen and submariners were killed, plus Ensign Sakamaki captured.
Given that success, why wasn't there a third wave? It seems like a logical next step.
That's been debated ever since. Some officers on Nagumo's staff urged him to launch a third strike. The targets would have been those crucial shore facilities, the repair shops, the oil tanks, maybe any remaining cruisers or destroyers.
Which could have been even more damaging in the long run.
Arguably, yes. But Admiral Nagumo decided against it. He was concerned about several things. American anti-aircraft fire was getting heavier and more effective as the morning wore on. He didn't know where the American carriers were a potentially lethal threat. His planes would be returning in darkness, increasing risks, and he felt they'd achieved their main goal, disabling the battleships.
So he decided to play it safe and withdraw.
Essentially, yes. Protect his own valuable carriers and consolidate the victory they'd achieved. But many, including Admiral Yamamoto later, felt it was a mistake. Not destroying the fuel tanks and repair yards allowed Pearl Harbor to remain a viable forward base for the U.S. Navy. Admiral Nimitz, who took command shortly after, famously said that leaving those facilities intact shortened the war by perhaps 2 years.
Wow. So the immediate aftermath, the U.S. declares war.
The news stunned America. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech rallied the nation. Congress declared war on Japan on December 8th. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. America was fully in World War II in both the Pacific and European theaters.
And the initial phase of the war in the Pacific didn't go well for the Allies, did it?
No, Japan followed up Pearl Harbor with rapid advances across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines fell, Singapore fell. It was a period of major setbacks for the U.S. and its allies. Pearl Harbor itself became a powerful symbol in American propaganda. Remember, Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry.
There was also a darker consequence domestically, wasn't there? The internment camps.
Tragically, yes. Fueled by fear and prejudice, exacerbated by the attack, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, were forcibly relocated from the West Coast to internment camps. An incident on the small Hawaiian island of Niihau, where a Japanese pilot who crashed there received some assistance from local residents of Japanese descent before being killed, was unfortunately used to fuel fears about loyalty, contributing to the justification for internment.
A truly regrettable chapter.
Right.
Switching back to the strategic view, how is Pearl Harbor assessed now?
It's seen as a brilliant tactical success for Japan, but a massive strategic failure. Rear Admiral Hara, who commanded a carrier division in the attack, summed it up later. "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war."
Because it unified America and brought its industrial might into the war?
Precisely. It galvanized American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. And strategically, as we discussed, the most important U.S. assets, the carriers, survived. The battleships, while symbolically important, were becoming less central to naval warfare anyway. The undamaged repair yards, fuel tanks, and especially the submarine base proved vital. U.S. submarines, operating out of Pearl, eventually strangled Japan's merchant shipping, crippling their war economy. And the code breakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor played a huge role later, particularly at Midway.
Which brings us back to the intelligence question. Was Pearl Harbor truly a complete surprise, or were there warnings missed?
There's significant evidence of failures. War games had shown Pearl Harbor's vulnerability. Some intelligence reports hinted at Japanese interest in the base. Admiral Richardson, the fleet commander before Kimmel, had strongly protested basing the fleet there, feeling it was too exposed and was relieved of command for his stance.
And then there are the conspiracy theories that Roosevelt or Churchill knew beforehand and let it happen?
Those theories persist, suggesting they needed the attack to overcome isolationist sentiment in the U.S. However, the vast majority of mainstream historians reject this. They point to a complex mix of factors: underestimating Japan, flawed intelligence analysis, poor communication between departments, bureaucratic inertia, and perhaps some wishful thinking. No definitive smoking gun proving prior knowledge and deliberate inaction by top leadership has ever emerged, though debates continue as new, sometimes ambiguous, information surfaces occasionally.
So, looking back, Pearl Harbor is far more than just a surprise attack. It's this complex knot of geopolitics, strategy, individual actions, luck, and miscalculation.
Absolutely. It's a pivotal moment where long brewing tensions exploded, dramatically altering the global conflict and America's role in the world. The tactical victory was stunning, but the strategic consequences ultimately doomed the empire that launched it.
And those unique stories, like Ensign Sakamaki becoming POW Tag 1 after his submarine mishaps, just add such a human, almost surreal layer to this massive historical event. It reminds you, history is lived by individuals.
Definitely. It underscores how even in meticulously planned operations, chance and individual circumstance play huge roles, and how a single event can ripple outwards with unforeseen consequences.
It really was a turning point, launching the U.S. fully into the war and setting the stage for the eventual Allied victory, but at a tremendous initial cost. What element of this story sticks with you the most? For you listening, what questions does this raise? We really encourage you to keep exploring these moments that shaped our world. And if you appreciated this deep dive and want more stories like it, please do hit that subscribe button for Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. We look forward to exploring more history with you next time.